On the 2nd of July 1966 at 5:35 in the morning on the Mururoa atoll in the Pacific Ocean, an atomic bomb was exploded. It was the first French nuclear test in Polynesia and would be part of a long series of tests. A few months earlier, General de Gaulle had withdrawn France from NATO's integrated command. For the Chief of State, France's military power was to be ensured through its mastery of nuclear warfare, a guarantor of the country's safety and military independence.
Je tiens à dire à la Polynésie française combien la France apprécie le service qu'elle lui rend en étant le siège de cette organisation qui doit assurer la paix à coup sûr à notre ensemble français.
2 years later, in September 1968, a young officer who just graduated from Saint Cyr, France's military academy, flew to Papeete, where he had been assigned. It's through his photographs that we can bring to life this episode of France's nuclear history. François Dullin was 27 and single. He was to spend 2 years in French Polynesia, 17,000 kilometers away from mainland France, and would witness several nuclear tests.
I took this photograph just before I left. My father, Colonel Louis Dullin, and mother. I think they were proud of me. In our household, de Gaulle was a hero, and a military career a family legacy. On top of my wardrobe, my helmet from Saint Cyr sits opposite that of my grandfather from the Great War. And on the wall are the military medals that had fascinated me ever since childhood. I was looking forward to discovering these beautiful islands, but was also proud to be involved in the mission to develop a French nuclear bomb.
Ever since France's establishment of the Pacific Centre for Experimentation, a joint organisation between engineers from the Commission for Atomic Energy and the Army, the face of French Polynesia had changed dramatically. Thousands of soldiers were spread across this territory the size of Europe, from the capital Papeete out to the most distant islands. The French Navy supplied the greatest number of men, but its Army and Air Force also participated in the operations. In total, there were 13,000 people, both civilian and military, who were involved with the nuclear bomb experiments.
From high in the air, the first thing I could see was the turquoise sea. It was postcard pretty. Once I stepped out of the plane, I received the ubiquitous flower necklace. The smell, the warm, humid air, had finally arrived in Polynesia. These are the first 2 photos I took in Tahiti. But after that, Arue Camp was more familiar. This is where I met those I had chosen to work with, the Foreign Legion. And more precisely, their civil engineering unit, a true army of builders. Here's the 5th R&P unit at work, the Mixed Pacific Regiment. They'd been here since the beginning, working across the region, roads, airports, bridges, tracks. These were the sorts of construction sites that many of them had been working on. I was assistant lieutenant to the technical equipment company, and I had 150 guys under my command. There were French, a few Vietnamese, and lots of Germans. They were brawny and tough. They didn't talk much and often had a past they wanted to hide. Typical legionnaires. Initially, I mostly did paperwork and administration. Our only military activity was a parade held on November 11th, 1968. And that wasn't all. I also learned that the government had decided to cancel the test planned for 1969 due to budget restrictions. I immediately requested a 1-year extension. I didn't want to have come all this way for nothing. I wanted to see the bomb explode. The older one said I was few, which is a Polynesian word meaning heaviness or wariness, a feeling that develops with the heat and boredom. I replied by comparing it to spleen, but my illusion was not particularly successful. Captain Smith helped himself to another beer without saying a word. Obviously, he didn't read Baudelaire very often. I was no more successful when I tried to play a jazz album on the Topaz record player. Duke, Miles, Sydney, they weren't really his thing either. I was introduced to poetry and music thanks to my Uncle Charles. Charles Dullin, ex-theater star, my godfather. A military father and an actor godfather. That might have been why my colleagues found me a bit strange. I was 8 when my uncle died, but I remember that he gave me my first camera.
"900 kilometers from Tahiti and 400 kilometers from Mururoa, Howe Island was chosen as the location of the forward operating base that would provide support for the testing site. Huge projects had been carried out on this thin strip of land lined with coconut trees. 2 harbors and a runway had already been built along with housing for 3,000 people.
Lieutenant Picard was so keen to take this photo, he almost ripped the camera out of my hands. "Finally, you're smiling. We need to capture the moment." It was the 5th of April. We had just moved to Howe, and it's true. I was happy to be there. We weren't at Mururoa yet, but we were getting closer, and I felt like my mission was finally starting. I went to have a look at our pride and joy, the support base's runway. It was more than 3,400 meters long, and large transport aircraft could land and take off from it. I took a lot of photos. There were big DC-8s, double-deck Brigade 2 planes, Neptunes, Catalinas from the Air Sea Unit, and also Vautours from the Loire Squadron with their missiles that would be fired into the atomic cloud to collect samples. It felt like all of France's military power was on display in front of me on this tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It made me think of French aviators Mermoz and Saint-Exupéry. And then I would turn around and see my crew painting fuel tanks. And I'd think to myself, they have a thankless job. They too are entitled to their moment of glory. Bad idea. After the second picture, Hans, a German legionnaire, came up and politely asked me to stop. True to their legend, legionnaires prefer to remain anonymous. The sound of applause made me turn around. On the tarmac, a few conscripted soldiers were returning to mainland France. When you arrived, you received flowers, and when you left, it was a shell necklace. But for me, this was just the beginning. I was transferred to CT1, the First Works Company. We slept in these corrugated iron cabins. In 50-degree heat, the guys worked at placing tarmac on roads, monitoring the power plant, or constructing new buildings. A few meters away from us, doing pretty much the same job, was the Air Force engineering crew. These soldiers were working on the landing strip and parking areas. Most of them were conscripted, and they didn't mind the photos. It meant they had a souvenir from their time in service. This was their Sergeant Roger. He actually asked me to take a photo of him in the hammock. See this? This and the double pay for work in the Pacific, that's why I'm here. Roger was going to return soon. He was making the most of his last moments in Polynesia after many long months spent in the Gambier Islands, building a landing strip with his men.
On the 27th of April 1969, a majority of French voted no in de Gaulle's regionalization referendum. Conceding defeat, the general resigned.
I have to admit that the general's resignation did get me down a little. I almost felt as if I'd gone to Polynesia for him. But I was still going to celebrate the Battle of Cameroon. Every year on the 30th of April, the Legion commemorates this battle, where in Mexico in 1863, 63 legionnaires held out for an entire day against 2,000 soldiers. I wrote a speech and prepared the song sheets. There were songs in French and in German. First we ate well, and then, as per the tradition, we drank lots of whiskey. The next day, there was a real commotion. The whole company was summoned. The party the night before had turned nasty. One of my men, a German, had wanted to stab someone who had asked whether his tattoos were Nazi symbols. As a punishment, he was assigned to the Mangariva weather station for a month, on his own. I used a black and white film to record the tense moment. I then loaded a movie-format film and boarded the boat to accompany him. As I left, Roger said that I was lucky. Mangareva is just next to Totogeji, where he had been posted for a year. Some of his favorite memories were from that spot. As soon as I had dropped my German off, I went to find some villagers. I photographed their smiling faces. It was wonderful to finally meet some real Polynesians. They offered me food and drink. It's a shame you can't smell the marinated fish in the picture. I left the island with Roger's last words running through my mind. The only problem with the Gambier Islands is that apparently they are right in the path of the radioactive cloud. I wasn't sure if he was joking or not.
In June 1969, Le Redoutable, France's first nuclear-powered submarine, completed its first dive. At around the same time, nuclear power stations were beginning to start up in France. First of all, Chinon, and then Saint-Laurent-des-Eaux began operation. Increasingly, whether for the military or for civilian energy production, France was choosing nuclear power as a tool to guarantee national independence.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
A few weeks later, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon.
I returned to Papeete for a few days. We watched the event on television. It felt strange. There were the Americans walking on the moon, and here we were playing in the sand. It was summer, which was usually the time the test took place. We should have been testing the bombs, but instead we were watching canoeing competitions. These are the Tuarai celebrations. They last for a month. There were French military on holiday everywhere. I watched races, competitions for splitting open coconuts. Without much enthusiasm, I photographed a javelin competition. The throwers had to hit a coconut at the top of a 9-meter-high pole. I admit they were talented, but that's not why I was there. I took 15 days leave and went to Thailand on my own. I took a photo as the air hostess said we were flying above Saigon. Far beneath me, young American soldiers were dying without really knowing why, and meanwhile, I was off to kill my boredom while waiting for the bomb. I explored Bangkok. I used up 2 films a day. I wanted to see other things, other faces. In the mornings, I traveled along the river among the vendors. In the evenings, I watched boxing matches, surrounded by an overexcited crowd. I even visited temples. Here, in Watarun, I asked a young monk to take a photo of me. There were flowers, the smell of incense, a sense of calm. Among all these statues of Buddha, I forgot Mururoa, nuclear weapons, France, the army. And then I went and visited Pat Pong. This was where Americans returning from Vietnam went for what they called rest and recreation. Prostitution, basically. Everywhere you looked, there were smiling young girls hanging off the arms of tall GIs. It wasn't my style. I went back to the hotel on my own. Once back in Papeete, I wanted to go and see all those places the local soldiers had talked about. The spots where Tahitian Bahini could be found, at Quinn's or the Papeete. I got drunk at Quinn's. Whenever I drink, I pull out my famous phrase, "Paradise for me is women and rivers of whiskey." I had glass after glass of whiskey. The dancers finished their show, and the soldiers left. I stayed right until closing and left while reciting Hamlet to a beautiful stranger. It must have been enough to seduce her. When I woke up, I had a headache, but she was a sight for sore eyes. Having seen my camera, she wanted to leave memories for me. Her husband worked for the French Commission for Atomic Energy, but was often on missions to the outer islands. She was bored. She loved the latest Gainsbourg. I returned to camp accompanied by the smell of Manoi, ready for a fresh start.
Before the nuclear tests began, Mururoa was uninhabited and had a coconut grove on it. But here too, many large construction works had been carried out. Female names were often used. There was the port zone called Kati, Fire Command Post Animon, and the living area Martin. Two huge blockhouses, Dandon and Denise, were the forward recording posts located right opposite the explosion sites. These concrete structures each weighed 60,000 tons and their walls were 5 to 10 meters thick. Approximately 4,000 people worked on the site. Most of them slept in boats in the harbour.
February 1970, I flew over Mururoa. I had been appointed to the Second Works Company. The locals called it Moruroa, and legend had it there was a treasure buried somewhere. Its name means big secret. What better name could it have? But conditions on the island were Spartan. We washed with water from rain tanks and were not allowed to eat fish from the lagoon because of the nearby explosions. One morning, I had an amusing encounter on La Maurienne, one of the base ships. I was buying camera film in the foyer. When I said my name, a young sailor called out to me, "Dullin, as in Charles?" Yes, he was my uncle. It turned out that this young kid came from Montmartre and lived on Place Charles Dullin, just opposite the theater workshop that my uncle had directed for many years. His name was Stefan Jadowski, but everyone called him Le Czech. He chatted to me for half an hour. He wanted to become an actor, like his friend Malengro with a beard. They performed breathless in their own way, talked about Belmondo, and discussed my uncle's text about the theater. It was surreal, but made me laugh. Stefan really did become a star on his boat. He invited me to a barbecue with his mates. On the menu was lamb from New Zealand, lots of the local beer, Manuya and Hanano, and pétanque with civilians from the CEA. It was one of the rare occasions where the various military forces mixed, as usually we stuck to our own, especially given the reputation of the Legionnaires. In fact, during the evening, Radio Coconut, which was a kind of Chinese whispers with local gossip, worked well. I was told about a Legionnaire who had eaten fish despite the ban, another who had burned himself after having challenged a Polynesian to walk on fire. These were impossible to verify, but they were part of the legend of Muru.
In the month of May, conditions were favourable and the first test in the 1970 campaign was given the go-ahead.
La météorologie, facteur très important dans la décision de tir, est établie à l'aide de renseignements provenant des stations à terre du réseau mis en place spécialement dans les atolls.
À J-3, le ballon qui supportera l'engin est gonflé.
Everyone was going to be evacuated from the atoll, which meant that the explosion was about to happen. It took place 700 meters offshore.
May 15, 1970, I boarded La Maurienne with Stéphane and his friends. I paused a moment to photograph the enormous moving operation. As the boats left the atoll, they took with them cars, trucks, and all the administrative documents. We retreated to approximately 50 kilometers from the zero point, the place where the bomb would explode. I'd been waiting for this moment for a year and a half. I felt nervous. My apprentice actor friends much less so. They made the most of the swell to play around. But it was a serious moment for me. The time for play acting was over. I was once again a military man in the service of my country. When we arrived at the site, we had to wait. Our instructions were not to look at the initial ball of fire and to turn around only after 6 seconds, wearing sunglasses.
When the explosion took place, there were only 8 people present at the onshore test command post. But dozens of measurement devices were activated. The order to fire was given at sea by the admiral in charge of the operation.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, feu!
First, there was silence, then a counting off of the seconds, and as instructed, we all turned around. To start with, no one said much. We weren't meant to take photos. But hidden behind a window, I pushed the button the first time. A young sailor came up behind me and did the same. And then a second. And when I returned to the bridge, Stéphane was showing off in front of the mushroom cloud. He asked me to take a photo for him. Behind him, the cloud remained visible for a long time, but apparently at that distance, there was no more radioactivity in the air than there was in my quartz watch. I savored the moment. There were only 5 countries in the world that had mastered the atomic bomb, and my country was one of them. The symbol of this power was before my very eyes. And I hardly dare say it, but it was beautiful.
Not long after the explosion, the Vautour airplanes fired their missiles into the cloud to collect samples. These missiles were then retrieved and brought back to Hao to be analysed, while the airplanes were washed at the far end of the runway. After a few hours, staff from the SMSR, the Mixed Service for Radiation Monitoring, were the first to return to Mururoa to measure the radioactivity. By the end of the day, everyone had returned to the atoll.
For the next explosion, I wore protective clothing and was able to fly over the irradiated zone. There were hundreds of dead fish, and there was still a burning smell in the air. But according to our meters, a few hours after the bomb, the radioactivity had indeed decreased.
In total, 8 tests were carried out in 1970, including one in the presence of Michel Debré, the Minister for Defence at the time. The campaign was a success.
After each explosion, the road was clean and painted. We were allowed to go onto the road, but not beyond the barbed wire. Otherwise, we would be sprung, as Stéphane used to say. I started to think about it more. Where did the radioactivity actually stop? Did it really disappear so quickly? I thought about the lagoon that we swam in and the rainwater we washed ourselves in. I wondered if the Polynesians would really stop eating fish. But I trusted my superiors. They maintained that all the necessary precautions had been taken. When I took off on the return flight to France, I noticed that there were no longer many coconut trees on the atoll. But I was happy. I had seen the bomb, which was why I'd come. And now it was time to go home. As I got off the plane, I heard the news flash.
La mort du général de Gaulle a fait l'effet d'une bombe à Paris où elle a été annoncée ce matin vers 9h30. La funeste nouvelle se propage actuellement comme une traînée de poudre.
It was an odd coincidence. I felt like a chapter in my life had come to an end.
The nuclear tests in French Polynesia continued. A total of 46 atmospheric tests were carried out from 1966 to 1974, followed by 146 underground tests from 1975 to 1996. In 1966, a secret report acknowledged that contamination had reached the Gambier Islands. The report recommended that this information remain undisclosed. Roger, François's friend who had spent several years there, later underwent an operation for thyroid disease, and Stéphane, the budding actor, contracted bladder cancer. In both cases, no link was officially made with the nuclear test. Today, in mainland France and French Polynesia, various organizations are fighting for recognition that these illnesses are related to radiation exposure. After his return from Polynesia, François Dullin left the Legion and began a career in the Secret Service in the Middle East. He did not marry and he did not have children. He died in 2015 of diabetes-related complications. At his house, his nephews and nieces found thousands of jazz records, souvenirs from his uncle Charles, and Aloha shirts from Tahiti.